It's been a while. I have a cold, that's why I sound a little weird. This wasn't like a second puberty that's happened in the past 2.5 years. So I've been gone a long time from BookTube, and particularly from the project that I was working on, Kingly Endeavors, where I was trying to read all of Stephen King's novels in chronological order, and to hopefully post a video a week about them. But just to jump back into it, I am kind of I'm back into the Stephen King thing. I don't want to make promises about launching right now from where I left off straight to completion, because as you probably know, Stephen King is still releasing 2 novels a year. But I want to jump right into talking about why I kind of disappeared for a while. There were a bunch of reasons. Part of the reason I stopped doing videos on YouTube is because I would just bend myself out of shape about trying to make sure that whatever it is I was presenting in the course of a video was my fucking sharpest, most nipple hardening insights, whittled down into, this is a weird gesture, whittled down into just a concise package. And when we last spoke, the place where I was in the chronology of Stephen King's bibliography, we were in the early 90s, and the early 90s / late 80s is the period where Stephen King was getting sober. And as he was getting sober, his books have always been very domestic and very much about the nuclear family. And Mike Stoklasa, who's one of the hosts of Red Letter Media's movie review channel, and he pointed out something that very few people know, which is that Stephen King's novel It actually had a co-author. 2 people wrote that book, and the co-author's name was Cocaine. So in that era when he was writing It and I think Needful Things and The Dark Half incidentally is the worst novel. Years have gone by since I've read it, and I still vividly remember some of those past, I remember there's a character named Clut, C-L-U-T, and apart from being completely flat, every time his name appeared on the page, I would blink out of the story, why would you name a character Clut? If your name is Clut, I'm sorry, it's a fine name. I was just reading H.W. Brands' biography of Richard Nixon, Reagan, and Reagan had somebody in his administration named Regan, which was a fucking I really thought 60 pages into that dynamic that my eye and my brain would accustom themselves to reading about a conversation between a character named Reagan and a character named Regan. It did not. But that's not the author's fault, and you could tell that H.W. Brands is crafting his sentences in such a way as to reduce the friction between those names. When Stephen King names a character Clut, and then uses that name again and again in the course of a dramatic scene. He didn't have to do that. Also, I was just reading Hillary Clinton's book What Happened, about about the 2016 election and where she was emotionally and mentally in the aftermath. And while I was reading that book, I was this, what comes to mind is an editorial process between a publishing house and a writer of whom they are afraid. You have to imagine that if Hillary Clinton were anyone but Hillary Clinton, a lot of people would have been saying, are you sure you want to write that? Are you sure you want to level that blow at the reader? And I hate to say it, but someone who's going to come up a lot here, fucking Steve Donahue was right. I don't think Stephen King was being edited at that time. Incidentally, I have a podcast now, and the podcast is reaching its 100th episode. I'm actually making this video to coincide with the release of that 100th episode. And somewhat recently, I interviewed the novelist Grady Hendrix about his new novel, The Final Girl Support Group, and we were talking about Stephen King, and he was this subject came up, Stephen King not being edited, and he made the persuasive argument for trying to edit modern Stephen King in the years 2010, 15, 20. This dude has been in the industry for 40 years, and he's just a monumental bestseller. His voice is ingrained in the minds of his readers who have been following him for 40 years in some cases. As an editor, how do you edit that guy? So in that case, it's understandable. But I think that in the mid-80s, when he was strung out on coke, the reason they were not editing him is because I'm suspecting that he was mercurial and frightening, because he was strung out on coke. And so those books were exhausting. The reason I mentioned that I still remember The Dark Half very vivid is I remember it so vividly because it remains, years later, the worst, not even the worst novel, the worst book I have ever read. I just don't know. Again, no, I guess I do know how it got out the door. It got out the door because I suspect that people were well, we got a lot of money invested in this writer, and he gave us a book, fuck it, we gotta make our money back. That was one reason that I kind of drifted away from Kingly Endeavors. The other reason, though, is because as he got sober, you start to see this shift, and it is a very interesting shift, where he starts getting more, compassionate, and I think he's a little more interested in exploring the interiors of his characters. But in the early and mid-90s, as Stephen King is sort of grooving into his sober voice, the books just fucking explode in length. Desperation, which is like 800 pages, and then The Wizard and the Glass, which is 1,000 pages, and then Dreamcatcher, I think, is 1,000 pages. And in my sharing Stephen King's 1990 hangover after a decade of cocaine abuse, I was not personally prepared to embark on all these fucking tomes, and so I needed to take a break of roughly 3 years. Another reason that I drifted away from it, of like a particular title that made me kind of move away, is The Wizard and the Glass, the fourth and I think the longest volume in his Dark Tower series. I very much like the Dark Tower series. I think it's great. I think it's incredibly imaginative, and I think the drawing of the three, which is volume 2, and The Wastelands, that was volume 3. Those are definitely both of those are in my top 10 Stephen King novels from the first like 31 or 32. But the fourth one is the first one in that series that is like explicitly high fantasy. And I don't like high fantasy, although it feels fucked up to say that of like an entire genre. Back to Steve Donahue. Another part of the reason I'm so remiss to say that I blanketly don't like high fantasy is because, to be honest, I have not sampled very much of it, but I have pointedly sampled like some of the most popular bits of high fantasy, and I just wasn't really engaged by them. And then one time I was in a Zoom call with Steve Donahue, and he was like, I was explaining this to him, and the reason I was explaining this to him is because I yielded to Steve Donahue's pistol-wielding insistence that everybody read Dune by Frank Herbert, which I thought was really good. I liked it. But I was explaining to him why I'm generally wary of high fantasy, and he was like, well, have you ever tried Lord of the Rings? And I said, yeah, I tried Lord of the Rings when I was in middle school, and I didn't really like it. And Steve said, you tried it in middle school, and you didn't really like it. And then he did this. The tongue of contempt is what I've come to call it. But yeah, I was not in the mood for fucking high fantasy, and I did. Stephen King's other high fantasy novel, Eyes of the Dragon, took me forever to read that book, and it's among his shortest books, but I just could not. Like, that world is so foreign to me, and I don't really look to get away. Like, I don't read. So little of my reading is like purely escapist. I have this weird dogged insistence that I need to gain something out of everything that I read, which is really narcissistic, because what I really mean when I'm like, oh, what am I gaining from this reading experience? What I mean from that is there some insight that I'm going to glean from this reading experience that I can then regurgitate at a bar to sound smart? Anyways, those are the reasons explaining my like Stephen King fatigue. And so, but now I've been working on the podcast, and the podcast finally has its footing, and I've realized like how, like, in order to stick with the podcast, which I was really dogged about, I realized like the only way I'm going to stick with any sort of creative endeavor, especially if it's kingly, is if I find a way of making the actual production of the thing fun and not stressful like at all. That's what I've managed to do with the podcast, and I did not know how to do that with the vlog, and so I think now I have to just be like more meh, like not plan things out, allow for conversation to go into digressions, whatever. And so that was part of it. I wanted to focus on the podcast, and I felt a little more at ease on the podcast because someone wasn't looking at my face, which, by the way, this is now the face of a 30-year-old man. When I started making these videos at the age of like 25, I think there's like an inherent charisma about being like 25 years old and like really agitated about books and super earnest. And I was a much different kind of reader back then. Not to say naive, but I was a moron. Or, just spacey about shit. Like when I was 25, if I would read a passage in a Stephen King book and he's talking about like the meaning of life or the presence of God in one's life, I would get like really earnest about the question. Like, I'd drop my chin on my fist and I'd be like, does God exist? I don't read that way. Now, at the age of 30, I know it's not like a fucking huge leap from 25 to 30. You're not a radically different person, but a lot of shit has changed. Like, for instance, like I'm now, like I'm at a point in my life where like if I see a really good piece of furniture, I'm like, I think it's like in my 20s I looked at books, like I was always looking for profundity and symbolism and metaphor and very like crafty shit, intellectual hijinks you can call them. Whereas now, if there is a big shift in my as a 30-year-old Stephen King reader as opposed to a 25-year-old Stephen King reader, I think it's that What I'm most interested in when I read now is voice and a feeling of company and a feeling of conversation. So anyways, yeah, now I'm done with the Green Mile. We'll talk about the Green Mile, and I'm like halfway into The Wizard in the Glass. And yeah, I'm going to post a link down below to my podcast, which I hope you will give it a look. I've been interviewing like authors there. Okay, so things are back as they were, tentatively. We'll see how it goes. And yeah, thanks for listening. Talk to you next time.